December 1891. Winter had wrapped the small town of Springfield in a quiet blanket of cold. Outside, the wind moved through bare trees like a slow whisper across the frozen ground. Snow pressed softly against the windows of a modest brick building belonging to the International YMCA Training School in Springfield, Massachusetts. Inside the gymnasium, the air felt different. Not warmer exactly, but restless. Wooden floorboards stretched across the room, worn smooth by countless footsteps. The faint smell of varnish mixed with cold air drifting in from the cracks near the windows. Somewhere above, a single light fixture flickered gently, casting long shadows that swayed across the empty court. And then there was the sound. A dull echo. A ball hitting the floor once. Then silence. In the far corner of the gym stood a young instructor. Tall and thoughtful, his hands resting lightly on the leather ball. His name was James Naismith. At that moment, he was not thinking about history. He was thinking about a problem. Winter had arrived, and with it came a familiar frustration. The students at the school were athletes, young men, full of restless energy. During warmer months, they ran across fields, played rugby, football, and other rough outdoor games. But winter locked those fields beneath ice and snow, and when the energy of young athletes had nowhere to go, it often turned into chaos. Inside the gymnasium, their usual indoor exercises had become dull. Tempers flared. Boredom spread like fog. Some games became too violent, others too slow. Injuries were becoming common. The school administration had given a quiet challenge to the young instructors standing there that winter: create a new game. Something fast, something exciting, something that could be played indoors, something that kept athletes moving. Without turning the gym into a battlefield, it sounded simple, but no one had solved it, and now the responsibility rested on the shoulders of a 30-year-old physical education teacher who had grown up thousands of miles away in the quiet rural landscapes of Ontario, Canada, long before the gymnasium in Springfield, before the whistles and wooden floors, before the bouncing of basketballs echoed through arenas around the world. There had been a boy running through fields. James Naismith was born in 1861 in the small town of Almonte, Ontario, a place where life moved slowly and seasons shaped daily existence. The forests were thick, the winters long, and the communities small. His childhood, however, was not untouched by hardship by the time he was 9 years old. Both of his parents had died from illness. Loss has a way of shaping a person quietly. It does not always arrive with loud tragedy. Sometimes it simply leaves a silence that follows a child through life. Young James was raised by relatives on a modest farm. There were chores to be done, wood to be chopped, fields to be worked. But there was also play. Children in small towns invent their own worlds, and James was no different. With friends, he played rough outdoor games in open fields and frozen ponds. They climbed trees, ran across hills, and competed in whatever games they could. Create from imagination alone. One of those childhood games would quietly plant the seed for something far greater. It was called Duck on a Rock. The game was simple. A small stone the duck was placed on top of a large rock. Players would stand at a distance and try to knock the stone off using thrown rocks. But brute strength rarely worked. If a player threw too hard, the stone would bounce away and become difficult to retrieve. The best players learned something different. They used arc. They learned to throw gently, letting the stone rise into the air and fall softly onto the target. Accuracy over force. Years later, that childhood memory would return in a quiet gymnasium in Massachusetts. But in 1891, standing in the echoing indoor space of the YMCA training school, James Naismith was not thinking about childhood games yet. He was thinking about restless students, young men who needed challenge, young men who needed competition, young men who needed something worth chasing. The problem with most indoor games? of the time was violence. Rugby and football were simply too rough for confined spaces. Players collided with walls. Injuries piled up quickly, Naismith understood something important about human nature and competition. When goals are horizontal, placed directly in front of players, people naturally charge forward. Collisions become inevitable. What if the goal was somewhere else? What if the target wasn't in front of the players, but above them? It was a quiet thought, not dramatic, not revolutionary in appearance. But sometimes the ideas that change the world arrive softly. A few days later, the young instructor asked the school janitor for 2 empty boxes that could be attached to the balcony railings at each end of the gym. The janitor returned with something slightly different, 2 old peach baskets. They were nailed to the railing, 10 feet above the floor, 10 feet, a number chosen not through complex mathematics, but simply because that was where the balcony happened to be. Beneath those baskets, James Naismith wrote down 13 simple rules. No running with the ball, no tackling, no violent contact. Players could pass, players could throw, and the objective was beautifully simple. Get the ball into the basket. The first game was played on December 21st, 1891. 18 students entered the gymnasium, 9 players on each team. The leather soccer ball felt strange in their hands as they passed it across the wooden floor at first. Confusion filled the air. Players bumped into each other, unsure how to move. The ball traveled awkwardly through the air. Some attempted wild throws that bounced harmlessly off the walls, but slowly something began to emerge. A rhythm, passing, movement, spacing, strategy. And when one player finally managed to toss the ball high enough that it dropped into the peach basket, the room erupted. Not because they knew history had been made, but because the game was fun. There was only one problem. Every time a basket was scored, someone had to climb a ladder to retrieve the ball. It was inconvenient, but inconvenience has never stopped. It's a great idea from spreading within weeks. The game began traveling beyond the walls of the YMCA school. Students carried the rules to other cities. Other gyms nailed baskets to balconies. Small variations appeared, and something fascinating began happening. The game belonged to everyone. Unlike sports that required large outdoor fields or expensive equipment, this new game required very little: a ball, 2 baskets, and space to move. Soon the sound of bouncing balls echoed through gymnasiums across the United States. Within a few years, it had crossed oceans. What began as a winter solution for restless students was quietly becoming one of the most beloved games on Earth. Decades passed. Peach baskets eventually gained holes. Backboards appeared. Dribbling became part of the game. Players began jumping higher, moving faster, inventing styles that early players could never have imagined. In 1946, a new professional league was born that would later become the National Basketball Association. Crowds filled enormous arenas, bright lights illuminated hardwood courts, and athletes with extraordinary talent turned the simple act of throwing a ball into a basket into something close to art. Players, like Michael Jordan, would one day glide through the air as if gravity itself had paused. Competitors like Kobe Bryant would transform discipline and obsession into legend. Millions of children across continents would stand alone on cracked outdoor courts, imagining the same dream. But long before the championships, before the crowds, before the roaring arenas and championship rings, there had simply been a quiet instructor trying to solve a winter problem. And that is often how the most meaningful inventions begin, not with ambition to change the world, but with the quiet desire to make something better. James Naismith lived long enough to see the game spread across nations. He watched as players improved the sport beyond anything he originally imagined. Yet the heart of the game remained the same, Ball, a target above, and the quiet human instinct to rise there is something symbolic about basketball that reaches beyond sport. The goal is always above you. You must look up. You must reach. You must try again after missing. And perhaps that is why the game resonates so deeply with people everywhere. Because in many ways, life itself is similar. Progress rarely happens through force alone. Just like the childhood game of duck on a rock, success often requires patience, arc, and precision, rather than pure strength. The quiet lessons inside the game mirror the quiet lessons inside life. Discipline, teamwork, persistence, humility. A missed shot does not end the game. It simply begins the next possession, and every player learns this truth eventually. The scoreboard only tells part of the story. The real transfer